joining me. My name is Mindy and today I'm going to be interviewing local author and instructor at the University of Washington, Scott Driscoll. Scott's new book, Better You Go Home, comes out in October 2013, and he's here with us today to talk about why he wrote it, how he wrote it, and what he learned while he was writing it. Thanks for joining us. Describe your book to someone who has not read it.
It's set mostly in the Czech Republic, so anyone who's interested at all in Eastern European history or family or culture would definitely find a lot to chew on in this novel. But it also has a Northwest connection. The protagonist is from Seattle. He's a lawyer who has a Czech father who fled the Czech Republic as the Nazis were coming in and never went back. And the protagonist goes on a quest back to the Czech Republic to find the village his father came from and to find relatives who were forgotten, and more particularly to find the half-sister that he was never told about until he found out inadvertently. So anyone who's not familiar with me or never read the book, they would definitely find a story. There is definitely a quest. Some unusual family secrets are unearthed, so even if I'm not interested in Eastern European stuff, there is a story there.
Thank you. So how is this a story only you could have written?
Well, the impetus for the story came from my own family. I have relatives who are Czech, though a couple of generations older than the way they're portrayed in the actual novel. And funnily enough, it was a side of the family, it was on my father's side of the family, that he never talked about. And so I knew that I had this elderly figure in my life as a child when we went back to Iowa to visit family who spoke Czech and didn't speak English, and I never thought that was too strange. But then as an adult, I wondered why no one ever talked about it. And just so happened that I went to Iowa to my aunt's funeral, to my father's sister, and a cousin at the funeral said to me, it's too bad that she died because now there's no one in the family who can speak enough Czech to translate the letters. And I said, letters? What letters? So this cousin gathered these letters that people had given her because she was interested. So various family members had given her these letters, and she said they're all in Czech, they're all handwritten, they're all written by family from over there. I can't translate it, I don't know what they're saying, but it could be something interesting. So, to cut to the chase, we found a relative who was a priest who spoke Czech, who was able to translate the letters. And in translating them, he discovered a couple of things. One of the relatives, the father figure in the letters, had illegitimate children and married bigamously in Iowa after leaving the Czech Republic without being divorced. And another figure there was an undoubted connection, committed suicide over there. And probably the connection was that the guy who committed suicide was married to the person who was illegitimately having children with my relative. No one knew that for sure. So of course when I heard that, I thought I have to go there and find this out for myself.
There's a story here.
There's definitely a story here. The problem is nobody knew exactly where the village was. So having had, and then the last thing the priest said was, I give you this information, I never want to talk about it again. To him it was so scandalous that he did not want to be confronted with this anymore. Wow. So I had to go find out.
Interesting. Well, what did you learn, if anything, from writing your book? What was it that you learned? What's the biggest lesson you learned?
Well, there were probably lessons that I should have already known anyway, but for one thing, if you're going to be serious as a writer, writing a novel versus memoir or creative nonfiction, you have to be able to make that imaginative leap from the hard facts, the documentary facts of life, to the story. When I first started off doing research for this, I became very interested in the family history and I found the farm. I interviewed relatives who were still living on the farm. I heard some interesting stories. I met the town historian, looked at the record books, saw the family members listed there, discovered that there was a family member who was unaccounted for, who was obviously an illegitimate child that no one was claiming. That's what really gave me the idea for the book. But when I set out to actually write a novel versus memoir, I was staying too close to the facts at first. I was doing a lot of reading history, a lot of research, so that I could, reading novels, reading history, reading essays, so that I could understand what was true for people who grew up in that culture. Because what I really wanted to know was, how did that side of the family grow up? What was their life like? All of my family grew up in the Midwest in Iowa and then moved west. What was our experience like compared to theirs? Had I descended from the people who never left, what would my life have become? And I was really curious to pursue that spur. But I was stuck on family history. And finally, in writing early drafts, like really only maybe 50 pages or so, I had my reviewers look at it and they said, there's no story here. This is all your research, but there's no story here. So I had to really set it aside, rethink, do a new set of research, completely rethink the characters in the story, and come up with a story that would allow me to search for these other truths rather than being stuck on my own family's history. And then the story started to unfold.
Oh, fascinating. All right. So as a writing instructor, what mistakes do you see writers most frequently make, and how best can they address them?
Writing novels?
Yes.
Well, one is the mistake of staying too close to family history. That's a common mistake made by first-time novelists. Another problem that I see quite a lot is writing insufficient detail. So a typical scenario is someone who's serious about writing a novel will do some research, they'll write the story, they'll have the story unfolding, and it'll be set somewhere like, let's say the Czech Republic, right? As far as the reader's concerned, that's where they're supposed to be going in their imagination. But there's no particular detail that says this must be and can only be in Pisechna or Prague or whatever. The details are generic. It's by a river, generic river. It's in a town square, generic town square. They're buying this, they're buying that. It's all generic. That's a real hurdle that learning writers have to overcome. And one more problem that I see quite a lot is a failure to understand the nature of the drama that should go into building scenes. It's overlooked. One assumes that if you can have people talking to each other, you can write a scene. Not true. Scenes have to be constructed in the same way a story is constructed.
Can you give them a couple tips on how to construct a scene?
Yeah. The most important thing is to think of it as a story arc. There has to be an opening beat. So any dramatic scene in the foreground, same applies to flashback scenes, though that's another issue. But any foreground scene, there has to be an opening beat that establishes a problem, which means you have to have characters who are at an imbalance. If you have balanced characters coming into a scene, nothing will happen. So you have imbalanced characters. One has more power, one has less. One of them is seeking, one of them is resisting. The one who's seeking has to make an overture. The one who's resisting resists. The initial beat has now been established. Low risk. We now know what the issue is. You turn away, you create a pause so the reader can gather the momentum for what's coming. Then the next beat has to establish an action-reaction sequence. So dramatic action, reaction, constantly pushing the level of risk to the main character, to a tipping point, and an emotional tipping point. All of this happens in beat 2. This is the place where usually beginning writers really break down. They have characters just talking back and forth at each other on a horizontal level. once you get into the middle beat of a scene, it has to push, push, push up a slope on a trajectory toward a tipping point. But your work's not done when you get to the tipping point. You still have the third structural beat of the scene. That's just as important. So after the emotional tipping point has been passed, you have to turn away, create a pause, then allow the characters one final action with each other to establish a final turning away toward a new situation. The entire purpose of writing a foreground scene is to take your main character from one situation to a different situation. If that's not what you're doing, then you don't need a scene.
Thank you. All right, so what is your next project?
A Latvian novel. I'm very interested in Eastern Europe for personal reasons, but also historically. All the large cataclysmic events social events that happened in the 20th century happened in Eastern Europe. I mean, we talk about World War. The epicenter of every single war that was fought was in Eastern Europe, because that was the collision point between the West and the East. And from the Baltics down through Poland, down through Czechoslovakia, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, continuing south, that was the fault line that cultures that could not get along had to cross in order to attack each other. Those people have suffered and suffered and suffered and suffered. I consider that part of the world to be a kind of pressure cooker.
Interesting. So what would the next project be about?
So, staying in the same pressure cooker, I'm moving further north. This time because I have a family connection to Latvia. And here's another country that was just about erased by the Soviets. And the only thing that really saved them was music. Song, music. That's what kept their culture alive.
Interesting.
And so this time what I wanted to do was write about a person who would belong to the progeny of exiles. So there's that generation of people who were young, coming off the end of World War II, who had to flee, and so they end up somewhere in the U.S., but they have children. And their children grow up, and their children do not grow up the same way as other children. They have a very different experience growing up, but they look like everyone else. They talk like everyone else, so no one notices. But in their own world, their world, the world they grow up in, is very different than everyone else's. And I wanted to write about that experience. So what I decided to write about is a character whose parents were flung out of Latvia, who had children in the U.S., whose children grew up speaking Latvian, who went to school in the U.S., and then as an adult, one of them becomes a composer, one of the most revered cultural icons in Latvia. He becomes a composer, goes to all the right schools in the U.S., gets the right degrees, gets teaching jobs, but no, he's nothing in the U.S. No one's interested in his music here. It means nothing to this culture. It means everything to that culture. So he goes on a quest back to Latvia to be the composer that he wants to be in a place that will honor that and where it will have some meaning, where it will have some impact. But that means he has to give up every creature comfort that he has, and then some. So that's just the beginning. And so with that as the entree into the story, then what I further want to dive into is the political corruption that must then be faced. All of the political higher-ups there, and this is true for this generation, might even be true for another generation, were in positions to benefit from the switch from the communist to the so-called democracy. Well, if they were in a position to benefit, that means that they were not playing by any normal rules. And those are the people who are in power right now. And many of them are former Soviets, which means they were not casual bystanders. They were there murdering people, torturing people, capturing people, sending people to gulags. They were there trying to ethnically cleanse Latvia of Latvians. Now those people are judges, school administrators, government officials. So I'm wondering what happens when a Latvian American who was raised here, not in that culture, goes there to that culture with ideals that we would all recognize and applaud, and runs into that. What happens?
Fascinating. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.